Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and detailed Xilonen guide. Xilonen is the newest 5-star Geo character in Genshin Impact, who's a very powerful support and healer who can give your team huge buffs, healing, and also has the option to be played as a DPS if you so choose. In today's video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about Xilonen, covering her different playstyles, best builds, weapons, artifacts, team comps, constellations, and so much more. I'm also going to include a showcase of a C0 Xilonen so you can know what to expect with this character in her various different teams. Before we begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and also excuse the slight delay on this guide as I had to do a lot of testing and get all the footage on my main account on the live server, which took a bit longer than expected. But with that out of the way, let's talk about Xilonen. Alright, so starting things off, what does Xilonen actually do? Well, firstly, her kit revolves highly around her elemental skill. This is an ability with a rambly amount of text, it's a lot, so let's summarize how it works. Firstly, when Xilonen uses her skill, she will enter the Night Soul's Blessing state, gaining 45 Night Soul points, hopping on roller skates, dashing forward, and dealing some geo damage. Outside of just that, next to her Night Soul bar will be 3 samplers, these little Doritos, that start off as geo in her base kit, but change based on the elements in your party. In fact, for each Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro character you have, one geo sample will change to that corresponding element, and through these samplers, Xilonen will be able to reduce the resistance of enemies to whatever types her samplers are. The way this works is you have to activate your samplers. In order to do this, you have to use your skill, at which point your Geosource sample will be active, and then in order to activate the other samplers of other elements, you will need to fill up your meter by getting 90 Night Soul points. This can be done through your first Ascension passive, allowing your normal and plunge attacks to generate 35 Night Soul points per hit, meaning that you just need to do 2 normal attacks to fill up your bar. So use your skill and then normal attack twice. Your Night Soul points will be full, you will consume them, and also reduce the resistance of whatever elements in your party you infused your samplers with. So what this means in practice is if your party has, for example, Xilonen, a Hydro, Pyro, and Electro unit, then once your Night Soul points are full, you will reduce the resistance of all 3 of those elements, the 3 elements of your samplers. Now, another thing to note though about this first passive, however, is that if you have fewer than 2 source samples that have had their elements changed, Xilonen will not be able to gain more Night Soul points and will instead deal more normal and plunge attack damage. This will make her more of an on-field main DPS and less of a support, allowing her to only shred the resistance of Geo and no other element. With that in mind, provided you have at least 2 characters of either Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro in your party, then you will trigger this passive and Xilonen will be a powerful support character, reducing the resistance of any of those elements. Now keep in mind a few things. 1, you can have multiple of the same element and still trigger this passive. For example, if you have 2 Geo characters and 2 Hydro, 2 of your source samplers will change from Geo to Electro and it will count towards making Xilonen a support. On the other hand, if you run her with 2 Geo characters and 1 non-Geo, then she will have the DPS part of this passive active. Lastly, worth noting that Anemo and Dendro supports don't count as a samplable element, meaning they won't change your sampler from Geo. To summarize this skill though, because it can seem more complicated than it has to be, you will enter a state where you'll shred resistance of enemies based on the types in your party, provided they are of an element that you can crystallize with, namely Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro. And obviously shredding Geo res as well if you run Xilonen with another Geo character, or technically Dendro or Anemo, but don't do that. Keeping a Geo sampler and reducing the resistance like that. Moving on, for Xilonen's elemental burst, here once again there will be one of 2 things that will happen. First of all, she will deal some damage scaling off her defense, and then will either heal or do more damage. If she's played in the supportive role where at least 2 source samples have been changed, then she will have continuous healing to the active character. This healing will last for 12 seconds, and while it is single target healing, it's a decent amount that is an essential part of her supportive kit. If, on the other hand, she has fewer than 2 source samples that have been changed, she will instead deal some AoE geo damage, scaling with her defense. This is an ability that has a 15-second cooldown and a 60 energy cost, meaning it's typically not that hard to get back. And for her second passive talent, Xilonen will trigger an effect equal to that of her Night Soul burst when her points are maxed, and whenever any party member triggers a Night Soul burst, Xilonen will increase her defense by 20% for 15 seconds, so basically just a passive giving you a bit more defense. Xilonen also comes with an exploration passive to help out in Natlan, which is nice but not the point of this video. Lastly, as far as your talent priority goes, you really want to maximize your elemental skill, level it as much as you can, crown it if you want, because it increases your elemental res decrease, being 36% at level 10, so very important to max out or at least get as high as you can. Afterwards, you can level your burst for more healing if that's something that matters to you. It's nice and recommended, but not mandatory. Lastly, you can ignore your normal attacks unless you're playing Xilonen as a DPS, in which case you should level them. Now for Xilonen's playstyle and some advanced tips, here's what you need to know. Firstly, Xilonen's capable of being played in 2 ways, either as an off-field support and healer or as an on-field damage dealer. Now it is important for me to disclose right now that she is much stronger, much more meta as a support and healer than as an on-field damage dealer. While I will touch on this briefly in the video as well, for the most part, what we will be more focused on is her supportive playstyle, where she really shines as one of the best supports in the game. This is because she acts as a healer while also having buffs at a similar level of Kazuha, as she will give you 36% resistance shred to the elements you're running, on top of also a 40% damage buff with the Scroll of the Hero City set, which we'll talk about later, on top of having really good uptime and not a complicated setup. While I don't like directly comparing her and Kazuha as much as other people have been doing, because they have different roles. Kazuha has grouping, elemental infusion, and damage, whereas Xilonen is a healer on top of a buffer. It is important to understand that her buffs and resistance shred is on a similar level than some of the premier meta supports, on top of being a healer, which makes her a really strong character in many teams. This is why, to tie it back to her playstyle, the supportive role is so favored and what we're going to be focusing on, because it's really strong and very easy to use. All you need to do is make sure that you're running characters of different elements, either pyro, hydro, electro, or cryo, at least 2 of them, with 2 of the same element being possible here as well. Using your elemental skill, doing 2 normal attacks, and then swapping out, passively decreasing the resistance of those elements in your party, and also acting as a healer through your burst. It's also important to mention that your burst is just a nice form of healing. It's nice to use it as often as possible, but unless you're playing someone like Farina, it's not mandatory in order to maximize your buffs. It's just nice for the healing, obviously. With that said, if you're running the Freedom Sworn weapon, which we'll talk about later, then it's also important to burst every rotation in order to get a second crystallize, one from your skills normals and one from your burst, to trigger its effect reliably. Shilonen's only real weakness is not having much geo application in general, especially from off-field as a support. No geo construct or anything like that, which can affect crystallizing with Navia, but I believe she more than makes up for it in many ways, notably through her very powerful buffs. Now, as far as her DPS playstyle goes, it's pretty straightforward. Just make sure you're getting your obsidian buff on your burst, using it after your skill, and you'll either just spam normal attacks after using all your support characters' buffs if you're playing her without Shen Yun, and if you're playing her with Shen Yun, then you can spam plunges. Just make sure you're not dash canceling them or dashing needlessly, as it consumes a lot of your Night Soul points. Another tip I want to mention about Xilonen is to make sure you're using your buffs efficiently. Well, the res trade on your skill is very easy to proc. You don't have to think about it, and as long as you do 2 normal attacks inside of your skill, you're gonna get your buff out to whatever elements you choose to run, and you don't have to worry about it at all. What you do need to keep in mind though is for the hero set, you want to be triggering crystallize of whatever elements you're dealing damage with. For most teams, this will be either 1 or 2 elements, and it will be pretty easy to do, but you actually do want to make sure you are triggering a crystallize or 2. And if you're running a team with multiple elements, for example, like a Melt Risley team, which we'll talk about later, it can be a bit more annoying to get a crystallize of both of your damage dealing elements. So you may have to pay a bit more attention to your setup, or accept that maybe you can only get 1 crystallize, but you'll still reduce the resistance of both of the elements through Shilonen's skill. A bit more advanced stuff, but basically just make sure you trigger a crystallize to trigger your set's buff, which should happen naturally in most teams, making sure it's of the correct element. Also, for a quick healing showcase of Xilonen so that you can know what to expect, here's my Xilonen on decent investment but nothing too crazy. I'm running a weapon that doesn't give me defense. I'm on the hero set on the standard defense healing bonus build with defense substats where I can find them, and my talent levels are not max, so there's room for improvement there. And as you can see, I am still doing pretty solid single target healing. Now obviously it's just going to be to the active character. It isn't team wide, but it's still more than enough healing to keep your team healthy, and also it can help enable a character like Farina who needs the healing to offset her HP drain. For Farina in particular though, you may have to spend a small amount of time cycling through your characters to make sure they all get healed, but for the most part it's a pretty solid amount of healing to your active character that scales with investment, and that's more than enough to keep you healthy, on top of also having incredible buffs, which is the main reason you're picking her, not just how much she can heal. Keep in mind though that, as I said, her healing scales well with investment, like getting her to level 90 and giving her defense, whereas even just at a baseline, provided you level her skills 10 level, she will give you buffs even at low investment. Before moving on, for my first impressions on Xilonen, I'm very pleased and she's really strong. I released a more detailed review earlier if you want to watch that, but to summarize and not repeat myself, I'll just say that she's someone who is very versatile, a strong buffer and healer that can fit many teams, and is almost always a good option. She's, in my opinion, one of the top tier supports. I think she's really strong and places alongside some of the best characters in the game. She can fit in so many teams and can even be ran alongside another incredible buffer like Kazuha, who you may already have. I don't think it's like a competition between the two because they do different things, but both are great, and Xilonen is definitely a good addition to most accounts if you want a buffer and or a healer. She does great at both, and she can also buff a geo carry as well. Really fits most teams outside of Anemo and Dendro, and I think that's great. Very versatile, very strong, and a great healer and support. Now with that said, you guys know how I feel about the term must pull, in the sense that Genshin doesn't really have content that's hard enough to warrant a character that you absolutely need, but as far as meta goes, as far as as versatility, strength, and overall importance of an addition to your account, I think strong, versatile supports are up there as having the highest pull value overall. Xilonen, in this case, is a very strong and versatile buffer and healer whom I think is up there as a top tier support and someone who I think is definitely meta. She fits so many teams and can also be paired alongside some of the other highest value supports, really strong characters like Farina and Kazuha, who can be paired alongside Xilonen or in another team, but you can use them together with like any hyper carry, and then boom, you have a really strong team comp, a ton of buffs for whatever your main carry is. Now, obviously, someone like Xilonen won't work with certain elements like Anemo or Dendro, but even then, you would just use her in your other team, and obviously, everyone's account, teams they're running, and all of that is different, so how valuable a character is for you will vary from player to player, but I do think that Xilonen is a top tier, very versatile, and very strong support, who's also easy to play, easy to build, and highly recommended in my opinion. For more information, obviously check out my last video. I don't want to ramble on over and over and repeat that stuff, so I'm gonna leave it at that. I think she's great. Don't feel forced to spend or anything, especially if you don't want her, but she gives you a ton of buffs, has good healing, and also look at her. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about how to build your Xilonen. Note that in the coming sections, we'll focus on a support Xilonen, the most recommended and optimal way of playing her, and then afterwards I will also include a short section explaining how to build a DPS Xilonen if that's what you want to focus on. Well, firstly, for your artifact sets, it is very straightforward. As we saw earlier, the Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City set, or Hero for short, is absolutely broken and virtually the only set you should play on Xilonen. It is akin to running Verdescent Veneer on a Anemo support, being a very strong supportive set that you should run on a Natlan support like Xilonen. In fact, what this set does is firstly give you 6 elemental energy on the 2-piece when a nearby party member triggers a Night Soul burst, so some free bonus energy, and then on the 4-piece, it will give a 40% elemental damage bonus, provided you're in the Night Soul's blessing state, which you will be in, to any elemental type involved in a reaction that you trigger. For Xilonen, this means when you crystallize, you will buff both Geo and whatever other element you're crystallizing with. On top of that, not only is the buff of 40% damage bonus really good, but it also lasts for 20 seconds, which is a really nice duration. If that wasn't enough, you can also obviously buff multiple elements at the same time if you crystallize different elements, and if you're running multiple damage dealing characters in your team of different elements. This synergizes very well with her kit and gives her more buffs on top of her inherent res shred, making it the go-to set and virtually the only one I can recommend. As mentioned, it also buffs Geo damage, so it works with a Geo carry as well, and please just farm for the hero set on Xilonen. It's very easy to get even if your substats aren't amazing, because the 4-piece set will trigger as long as you trigger one reaction, which is very easy. With that in mind, if you already have a hero set in your team or want to run another set for whatever reason, you could use a generic buffing set like Petra, but again, I generally recommend going for the hero set because of how broken it is. Now for the stats you want on Xilonen, here once again it's very straightforward. The only real stats that matter for her are energy recharge to burst when you need it, defense to increase your healing amount, and then lastly crit rate if you are running a Favonius weapon. Now as far as Xilonen's personal damage goes, unless you are playing her as a main DPS, it really isn't the main part of her kit. It's not something you need to min-max, and the big chunk of your utility, the reason why she is such a strong character, as we saw earlier, is the res shred, buffs, and healing that she gives you. Now the buffs from the hero set, obviously you just get by running the set, and the buffs from your res shred you get from your elemental skill and leveling its talent. Because of this, even if your artifacts don't have any good stats on them, provided you're using your skill and triggering one crystallize, you will fully buff your team and not need to care about anything. This means that Xilonen, even at low investment, without the perfect stats, will still be a high value unit. Now where stats come in is to be able to burst more often and heal for higher. Your healing comes through your burst and it scales with defense. Because of this, having enough energy recharge to burst when you need it, typically not needing that much given that Xilonen's burst cost is only 60 and you're also running the hero set that gives you energy, needing typically only around 130 to 140 energy recharge if you want to use your burst on cooldown, and then stacking defense to get more healing from every burst tick. For those reasons, you should look for either defense percent or energy recharge on your sands, defense percent on your goblet, and for your circlet there are 3 main options. Firstly, healing bonus is the best to maximize your healing, and it will be the typical go-to for most players. With that in mind, if you're running the Favonius sword, which we'll talk about in the next section, then running a crit rate circlet can help to trigger its effect more reliably at the cost of some healing. Lastly, you could also run a defense percent circlet if you don't have a good healing bonus one or want to increase your defense and make it a bit higher. Keep in mind that if you're running Xilonen's signature, you want 3200 defense, so make sure to look for that if you choose to run that weapon. Outside of that, defense is just nice, mostly for your healing, and the same can be said about having a bit of energy recharge, so look for those stats on all of your pieces. Keep in mind that because Xilonen's personal damage when played as a support and healer is not very high, trying to maximize your crit rate and crit damage isn't recommended compared to just playing a relatively lower investment healer build, focusing on defense, some energy energy recharge, and maybe crit rate if you're running Favonius. Oh, and also I did want to technically mention that if you're in a team where you really don't need healing and maybe value your crystallized shield being stronger, you can technically look for elemental mastery for a stronger crystallized shield. Maybe if you're playing someone like Linny or Arlecchino, but not the recommended way to build her generally, but it can have its uses for sure. Alright, so next up for the weapons you want on Xilonen, it is very straightforward once again. Now, as we previously saw, Xilonen's a character who wants to capitalize on her buffs. For those reasons, having a weapon that gives you more buffing capabilities, a more supportive role, a bigger buff, or anything like that will be favored over just a stat stick. For those reasons, there are three main options you can go for. Firstly, Xilonen's signature weapon, Peak Patrol, is going to be her general best in slot. This weapon gives you a ton of defense, which helps with healing, but even more importantly, it will also, through its effect, give your entire team up to 25.6% elemental damage bonus, provided you do 2 normal attacks, which is something you want to be doing anyways, so very easy. The buff lasts for 15 seconds, and you will cap it out at this 25.6%, provided you have 3200 defense on your Xilonen, which really is not that hard to get, provided you build her correctly. Because of this nice damage bonus, scaling with your defense, on top of also being a stat stick that gives you a lot of defense to help with your healing, this weapon is definitely a great choice and one that gives your Xilonen even more buffs. Now, while it is your best in slot, a weapon that can actually be similar in a lot of situations, provided your team can use the buffs that it gives you, is the Freedom Sworn 5-star. The Freedom Sworn gives you elemental mastery instead of defense, however, so obviously you'll lose out on a lot of healing, but for all intents and purposes, the buffs that you get from this weapon are actually very high and can perform similarly in teams that can make use of them. This is because this weapon will give your team a 16% normal charge and plunge attack damage increase, on top of also getting 20% attack, being a solid amount of buffs for whatever unit you're running, provided they scale on attack and do either normal, charge, or plunge attacks. In those teams where you can make use of these buffs, as I said, this weapon is competitive with your signature and is really solid overall, although your healing will be a decent amount lower, but usually that's not the end of the world. With that in mind, it's also worth pointing out that in order to proc Freedom Sworn, you want to trigger 2 elemental reactions, so crystallize twice, which again shouldn't be too hard to do, but you do need to be mindful of it. Outside of these 2 5-stars, a third option that's really good for your team as well is the Favonius Sword. This is a 4-star weapon that's just a generic supportive weapon that gives your team more energy when you trigger a critical hit. It also has ER on its effect, which can help with Xilonen, but even if you don't need that much ER on your Xilonen, the effect giving your entire team energy makes it a solid supportive weapon that you can use as a great 4-star option. It's also worth pointing out that once again, I would value any of these weapons that gives your team a buff instead of just getting stats for your Xilonen, because for example, being able to get more energy on your other characters who may need more ER without it will allow them to build more offensive stats like crit and attack instead of having to build energy recharge and thus increasing your team's damage. Now with that said, if you don't have any of the 3 weapons I mentioned, you can go for the new Natlan craftable sword, the Flute of Espizal, which just gives you a lot of defense, thus increasing your healing. Overall, I recommend either running Peak Patrol, Freedom Sworn, or Favonius, depending on which one you have, and if you have neither of the buffing weapons, then you can just go for the new craftable. And lastly, before moving on, if you're wondering how to build a DPS Xilonen, it's very straightforward. Artifact-wise, you'll go for the Obsidian Codex for a ton of crit rate. You'll look for defense, geo damage bonus, and crit. Typically crit damage because you get a lot of crit rate through Obsidian. And for your weapon, any crit stat stick is fine. Defense percent stat sticks work as well. And you could just look for any solid, like 5-star or 4-star weapon you have that gives you a lot of stats, with obviously her signature weapon being the best. Rakumi Sagiri or even Harbinger of Dawn if you're shielded, as well as any generic crit 5-star, and even the new craftable Flute of Espizal is a solid stat stick. So really just go for these generic swords that give you crit or defense, and look for those same stats on top of geo damage bonus on your pieces. Alright, now moving on for Xilonen's Constellations, here's what you need to know. Firstly, Xilonen C1 is pretty weird. It lets you stay in Night Soul Blessing for a lot longer, and also decreases your consumption of Night Soul points and Phlogiston, helping notably for exploration, while also giving you increased interruption resistance to nearby active characters. This constellation gives you nice quality of life and can help if you're either using Xilonen as a main DPS or exploring with her, but outside of that, it's not that recommended and not that great, at least meta and combat wise. With that in mind, Xilonen's second constellation is quite a bit stronger. Xilonen C2 will firstly allow her Geo Source sample to always remain active, allowing you to run a third Geo character with a Geo carry like Ito or Navia, allowing her to shred Geo resistance even in a team with 2 Geos where she'd typically be a DPS, with the Geo res shred expiring at C0 when you swap out of her Night Soul state if she's not in her support role, but staying at C2 even if paired with 2 other Geo characters. Outside of just that though, all of your party members will gain bonuses corresponding to the active source sample that matches their elements, giving damage bonus to Geo characters, attack to Pyro, HP to Hydro, crit damage to Cryo, and energy and elemental burst cooldown reduction to Electro characters. Overall, overall, this is a solid supportive constellation, which will typically just give all of your party members more damage and make them stronger. This is a solid early stopping point if you want to go further than just C0 Xilonen. Next up, your C3 and 5 increase your talent levels, with C3 increasing your skill level, therefore reducing the resistance of enemies even further. It's nice, but nothing amazing. And your C4 will grant your active party members the Blooming Blessing state for 4 attacks, where they'll deal a bit more damage based on Xilonen's defense. They'll have their normal charge and plunge attack damage increased temporarily each rotation, which ends up being a small damage increase. It's nice, but it's not nearly as good as her C2. Lastly, for Xilonen's 6th constellation, here you have a giant wall of text, basically enabling her to be much stronger on-field carry. Inside of her Night Soul Blessing state, she'll have her Night Soul Blessing timer paused, she'll deal more damage, scaling with her defense, and she will also heal nearby party members as she does this. This will all be done through an imperishable Knight's Blessing that lasts for 5 seconds and then you can get once every 15 seconds, just enabling her to be a stronger on-field unit if that's how you want to play her. Overall though, I'd say Xilonen's best early stopping point is her C2, a sizable team buff, genuinely, but obviously not something that's necessary, as Xilonen is a really strong character, borderline broken in my opinion, even at C0. With that in mind, as far as vertical investment goes, I'd say C2 is better than her signature weapon, which is better than her first constellation, in that order. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about Xilonen's best teams and synergies. Well, firstly, it's important to mention that as a healer who gives you very versatile and strong buffs, she is someone who can be used in almost any team that needs a healer, and who are running at least 2 characters that are either Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo. She will therefore work with a ton of different carries in a ton of different teams. And so while I can't cover absolutely everything in this video, here is what you need to know for the most part. Firstly, in a lot of existing team comps, she can act as your healer option and also buffer a 2-in-1 whenever you have a flex slot or need a healer. A lot of the times she can work in teams where Kazuha would otherwise work, or where you would run another healer, providing you're running characters of the elements that I mentioned earlier. To go over some specific teams, firstly, she works very well with Neuvillette, where she can be played alongside Kazuha and Furina in one of the highest DPS teams just ever. It's a really solid Neuvillette team, and if you want, you can still run a shielder here, either instead of one of the supports or instead of Xilonen herself. I'd say this is mostly relevant if your Neuvillette is not C1. For a C0 Neuvillette, having a shield or some form of interruption resistance can still be nice, and Xilonen doesn't really give you much of that outside of a small crystallized shield, so there could still be merits to running someone like Zhongli over her, but the damage that she gives you will be higher, so she's definitely a good option here. Outside of that, you can also run her with characters who don't have the best existing support options like Mualani. While Mualani is a great DPS, a genuinely very strong one, she is missing supports that synergize very well with her, and Xilonen is a perfect option. Xilonen will give you a huge amount of buffs for your Mualani and any other damage dealers you may have in your team through the hero set and her elemental skill. She also obviously acts as your healer and definitely fits Mualani teams to make them quite a bit better. Personally, I've even advocated for running a low investment and under-leveled Kachina on the hero set in a Mualani team, and Xilonen is just a strict upgrade. Note that for the other slots in a Mualani team, it's pretty flexible. Obviously, you want a Pyro applier to be able to vape on your Mualani, and you can follow the general supports I recommend in my Mualani guide. Outside of that, Xilonen can also be played with some Geo carries. Now, while she's not made to be played in a mono Geo team, unless you have her C2 where you can actually run a triple Geo comp, you can run Xilonen with one other Geo carry and then 2 elemental supports. This means she can work with Navia to give you a ton of damage buffs, buffing Geo and reducing the resistance of enemies for your entire team, and the same can be said with Ito. Now, a few disclaimers here are that, firstly, for Ito, you can't really run Goro in a team like this. You can only run Ito, Xilonen, and then you'd have to run 2 supports of either Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo in order to get her buffs and trigger her A1 passive. With that in mind though, it's still one of the strongest Ito teams because of your off-field supports also benefiting from your buffs and doing a lot of damage. If you want to play a mono Geo team, however, you would either need to have Xilonen as your main DPS or need her second constellation. Now, regarding Navia, I think Xilonen works very well with her because of how much damage you're gaining, Geo damage bonus, res shred, and also buffing your off-field supports. One thing you need to keep in mind, however, is that Navia won't get as many crystallizes in this team. It's something that I've heard people complain about, and it's valid. You won't have an off-field Geo construct like if you're running someone like Albedo, Chiori, Zhongli, or even Kachina. With that in mind, the damage that Xilonen gives you is definitely big and can make up for it provided you're triggering enough crystallizes through Navia's burst and attacks, which may or may not be the case depending on what you're fighting and your rotation. While Navia herself can generate a decent amount of crystallizes to sometimes be at full stacks, obviously having another Geo support that can aid with that does add up, but it's worth mentioning that Xilonen's buffs do make up for any lost stacks provided you still have a good amount. Obviously you want to try to get 6 on your Navia's skill, but even if you have at least 3, Xilonen will give you a lot of buffs to make her at least a very strong and viable option in a Navia team. Outside of that, there are really a ton of different elemental DPSs you can run with Xilonen. You could play with a pyro carry like Arlecchino, Xiutao, or virtually any pyro carry at all, either playing them in a vape team, mono pyro, or whatever you choose. For Arlecchino in particular, if you were to run an old team like this one, well, basically any of the last two slots, Xiangling or Zhongli, could be replaced with Xilonen. If you're playing a vape team, you can also run Xilonen here, although it may be a bit more difficult to trigger a pyro crystallize past your first rotation. The same can be said with a lot of other pyro carries, as I mentioned, and something to point out is that in a team like this, where you're running an elemental DPS with, for example, Furina, Yelan, and Xilonen, well, this double hydro support core can be ran with Xilonen and almost any elemental DPS. While I may be exaggerating a little, the fact that Furina and Yelan are both very powerful off-field hydro supports who give you the hydro resonance as well as a lot of buffs and personal damage, running Xilonen alongside them will give you healing for Furina. Even though it's not the best, it's usually enough if you built her correctly and know what you're doing, on top of also increasing your hydro damage and the damage of whatever your main DPS is. So if you're running someone like Xiutao or even Raiden Shogun, well, they'll have good personal damage, and so will your off-field supports, who are all also buffing you on top of Xilonen, who's buffing both of them and giving you healing. So I really like this double hydro Furina Yelan or even Furina Xingqiu core alongside various different main DPSs and Xilonen. Naturally, this works for Xiutao, Raiden, and others. You can also play aggravate teams with Xilonen, where she's just a solid option if you need a healer and also a buffer. While personally in aggravate teams, I really like running someone like Sucrose or especially Kazuha if you already have a defensive option like Baiju or Yao Yao in your team. Gives you a lot of buffs and also has great personal damage and grouping, which I think matters in this team and definitely adds up. But if you don't have a defensive option or just want a generic buffer, Xilonen works in aggravate as well. Another team I'm very excited about is actually melt teams, particularly with Wriothesley, but just melt in general, where you can run Xilonen as a solid buffer. While a lot of the times you'd run someone like Shenhe or an Anemo support like Kazuha here, if you choose to run an Anemo support, it can be very difficult, you'll find, to actually swirl cryo and pyro in this team. Past the first rotation, where enemies are already fully affected by pyro through Shangling's spinning pyronado, it can be hard to get cryo out on the enemy in order to swirl it and buff your damage. For those reasons, running someone like Xilonen, who will not only be able to trigger hydro crystallize at the start of your first rotation, but then afterwards being able to still buff both cryo and pyro, even if everything's pyro and you can't get cryo on anything, well, at least Shilonen's skill will still offer the resistance shred that you otherwise would lose out on. So that's something to keep in mind. I think she helps out and is a solid, really strong option in a team like Wriothesley Melt, where ideally you can trigger crystallize of both elements, but even if you can't, her skill gives you buffs nonetheless. You can also run her in many other teams where you're trying to reduce the resistance of multiple elements at once, and where you may not be able to do so consistently with an Anemo support. With that in mind, you can also use her in variations of a national team with Xiangling and kind of whoever. If you're playing international with Child and Xiangling, I would still recommend running someone like Kazuha if you can reliably double swirl, but if you can't, or even just in general, Xilonen can be a fine option, increasing your damage in these teams. Lastly, if you're wondering for a DPS Xilonen, there's really two things you can do team-wise, and that's first of all, make sure you have enough Geo samplers in your team to get her DPS mode and not her support one, meaning you either want to run her with 2 Geo supports or 1 Geo and then 1 basically non-reactable element. So Anemo, for example, someone like Shan Yun can work in order to let your Xilonen be a main DPS. Now, the two main teams that I've enjoyed are firstly the more standard one where you're just playing her for normal attacks alongside Goro and then 2 flex options. You can run someone like Yelan or Furina here as your flex slot, but keep in mind that with Furina, a healer would be wanted, as even if you have C6 Goro, typically it's not enough, but I guess you can make it work. For the most part though, if you don't have enough healing, you could do something like Xilonen, Goro, a generic flex support like Yelan, and then another Geo character in your last slot like Chiori, Albedo, or Zhongli. Outside of that, the more popular team, one that I've enjoyed and that I think is very funny, is a plunge Xilonen. Her plunge is not bad. You can spam it, just make sure you're not dash canceling, as dashing wastes a lot of your Night Soul points. And you can run Goro, Furina, and Shan Yun, who acts as your healer, with all 3 of these supports buffing your Xilonen, who obviously doesn't heal in her DPS form, but will trade that off for pretty good damage. Keep in mind that if you're running the Obsidian set on Xilonen, you want to burst after entering Night Soul, so after using your skill, and outside of that, just have fun with the team. And so as you can see, there are a ton of existing team comps and some slightly newer ones that work with Xilonen because of how universal of a support and healer she is. In case you're wondering about Furina or in synergy with her, well, note that Shilonen's healing is typically enough if invested into properly, and you may have to swap through your characters since it is single target healing. Overall though, it's fine, and as you can see, there are really a ton of teams that work. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's get into a showcase of my C0 Xilonen in various teams being a super powerful support. Now before we do that, I want to say that for DPS Xilonen and footage of that I've included throughout the video so you can get an idea of what to expect, but obviously you could do more with higher investment and higher talent levels. Now, I do want to show her off in the more meta teams though, in team comps where she really shines as a top tier support, which is what I mostly recommend and what I'm going to be showcasing. I'm running my Xilonen on a bit over 3k defense with honestly more ER than needed, running Freedom Sworn and also the hero set, a healing bonus circlet, and the rest is kind of irrelevant. With that in mind, I do have a level 10 skill and a level 8 burst, so you could get more healing with a higher burst level, but honestly, just maxing out your res shred is like your #1 priority, so I followed my own advice and did it. Outside of that, my Xilonen is C0, and every main DPS you'll be looking at in this showcase will be C0. So yeah, because I can't really decide which team to use because Xilonen can be used in so many, I'm going to include one clip from a few different teams. I've honestly had so many good clears that it's hard to choose just one, so I'll show off 3 different teams. With that said, I hope you enjoyed the guide, and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go.
Everybody stand back! Fellow warfare, I guess. Letting great names echo. Teamwork is teamwork. Bring it. Letting great names echo. Eat this. Nice and spicy. Let ride. Amazing. Let's shred, turkey.
And so yeah, as you can see, the DPS characters I'm running, while it's mostly a showcase of them, are getting huge buffs from Xilonen, who's also healing and enabling Farina's buffs, and overall it's just a really nice synergy. Xilonen is a character that I'm very happy with, a super strong support that I can recommend. If you're looking for one, don't feel forced or anything, but she's really good. I'm happy with her, and I'm gonna leave it at that. If there's anything I want to add, as always, it will be in a pinned comment because she's new, so things may change. As always, I hope you enjoyed the guide, I hope it was helpful, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.